Electric Cafe.
Hey everybody, welcome back to Electric Cafe. It's been a few weeks since I made a video. I apologize for that. Just doing some things in my personal life and also enjoying a lot of sports. My mom had surgery last week on her back, and so I was spending some time with her. And also, there's been so many sports on lately. I've been watching the French Open, the NBA Finals, the hockey playoffs, and also the World Cup started last week. So it's just been so much going on that I haven't had free time to make some videos. But in the meantime, I've still been listening to music as always and rating music. I probably have about 30 videos to do that I just have lined up from albums that I've been listening to and rating along the way. And whenever I listen to an album now, it seems like I'm pulling up my notepad and starting to rate it just so I can do a future video. Um, in the meantime, the new Boards of Canada album came out, and I got that in the mail. And I've been listening to it on and off for the last couple of weeks. And the new album's called Inferno, which I believe is their sixth album. This is the first time they've been on my channel. I was kind of waiting for them to come out with a new album to kind of start reviewing some of their albums, and I'll certainly do that. But first off, I wanted to talk a little bit about BOC's background and, or maybe just my experience with them, and just maybe show you a little bit of my collection along the way and just my history with Boards of Canada. So it started off, I was following Warp Records probably since I don't know, maybe like '92 or '93, pretty early on for probably an American. I don't think a lot of American people were following Warp in those days. This is a little bit before Aphex Twin was on there. Uh, at the time, Warp was releasing a lot of really cool techno, and it was verging on rave stuff like they've had so many seminal rave tracks, from Nightmares on Wax, on Test Tone, DJ Tricky, LFO, Forge Masters. There's been so many classic. In fact, one of these days I'll have to show some of my old Warp compilations. I have a couple of compilations that are filled with great Warp tracks, and from like 90, I think it was like 91, 90, through the bleep period of techno in UK and all the way through 93, maybe 92, 93, they had a slew of great techno tracks. And then around 93 is when they started their artificial intelligence series, the sort of IDM sound, ambient techno sound as well, and sort of forging that avenue towards it. And of course, then they released and signed, legendary albums by Aphex Twin and Autech and Boards of Canada. And they've continued to be one of the top, I'll probably say, most popular electronic UK labels of all time, and perhaps arguably one of the most important electronic labels in the past 35 plus years. So my experience with Boards of Canada started right after Music Has a Right to Children came out. And for me, this album was important because I got my brother into Boards of Canada around the same time. I got him a copy as well, I think for Christmas at the time, and he's become a big fan, along with Aphex Twin and Autech, the past 25 years. I've been, as they come out, I talked to my brother. I've been to a few shows. My brother, we saw Autech in concert, but we always talk about Aphex Twin and Boards of Canada, and he enjoys the music as much as I do, so we have that connection. And that really started my interest in Boards of Canada and Scam records, and also got deeper into more Warp records. And this record is considered a classic for electronic music. If I was to rate myself on a 1 through 10 of being a Boards of Canada, I'm probably somewhere around an 8 or 9. I'm not like a cult fan where I'm following everything they do, and there's some really hardcore Aphex Twin fans, hardcore Autech fans, hardcore Boards of Canada fans. I'm not quite at that level, but I'm probably an 8 or 9. I really love their albums, and their albums are something I go back to a lot. But they're kind of a prime example for me of why I buy music on CDs. Like, they're a long player album. I don't necessarily DJ a lot with their music, although I have some of their stuff on vinyl. I find me not playing certain album or certain bands on vinyl, so I end up really going towards CD. And this is a good example of excuse me, of an artist that I bought some vinyl on, but then I really settled on buying them CDs because they're long players and they really they play well, and I don't necessarily want to keep turning over the record and things like that. And they just fit better on CDs, and I can take them with me on trips. And I've always had a CD player in my car, so yeah, I've really just enjoyed them on CD. And so that was the first purchase, and then shortly after I got Boards of Canada, one of my favorite tracks of all time by Boards of Canada, "Beautiful Place Out in the Country" on CD, and I followed it up with a vinyl copy. And this is one of my favorite colors of vinyl. I don't like to show color vinyls a lot, but I probably could all day. I have hundreds and hundreds of really special colored albums, but I'm not one of those people who like to show off a lot. But this is one of my favorite kind of colors of blue. There's a very light white, kind of cloudy. It's kind of hard to see, but there's kind of a white cloudy effect inside of it that's very subtle, but it's very nice. I really love this vinyl. I don't think I've played this since I bought it, because I have it on CD. It's pristine. I can't remember. I'm pretty sure I bought this originally as new. I'm like 100% sure, or maybe 99% sure, just because I can't remember it, but I don't think I've ever played that. And it's because I like playing it on CDs. I have CD mixers. If I'm a mix, I want to play it. I just don't often pull out my collection for certain bands. But Boards of Canada is one of those artists that I love so much that I buy vinyl and CD a lot of times. If it's it depends how much money I have at the time, really. So at that also that around that time I pulled and bought up High Scores, and this is the kind of the Braille version. Unfortunately, Tower Records put their sticker on here. That was kind of unfortunate, but this is kind of the Braille version. I don't know how early this is. Probably one of the first copies of this, or the first versions of this. I think they put out some ones on the normal CD, but this is one of the digi cards or digi sleeves ones, which I love. These, they're nice and compact. They do get lost in the CD, in my CD bins. But I generally like that because it saves space, and they're just ergonomic, better than CDs, and a lot of times the plastic cracks and stuff like that. But then also shortly after, I bought a copy of Twoism in probably 2002. I think they reissued for the first time. This was originally featured on, I think it was Music 70. Boards of Canada was originally on. And they released this back in '95, I think, on cassette and vinyl copy. But then when Warp picked them up in 1998 and did Music Has Right, they just blew up. And that was also because of Scam Records as well, which they released some tracks on some of the compilations there. But then they had two cassette, releases on Music 70, and then Maxima as well. And then they went to Music Has the Right in 1988. So there was a couple cassette-only releases that are very limited, and I've actually never seen a copy of those, but I've seen some copies online of those. Very rare. There's, who knows how many copies there are, 30 or 50 cassettes of some of those. I've never even really seen some of those go on for sale, but I'm not that hardcore enough to buy one of those for hundreds of dollars, which I probably imagine they go for. But this came out in 2002, was reissued right after the success of Music Has Right again, and this is a funny thing about this is you can see I have the price tag on here. I bought this one new in 2002, and I guess this was considered a mini EP for the time because there's 4 tracks on each side, so it's kind of got like a mini album feel. Not necessarily a full album, but the price is $15.99, which shows you in those lean times of vinyl buying, to pick up a Boards of Canada record brand new for $15.99, even if it was a mini EP, which was properly priced. But if this was a mini EP and it had Boards of Canada's now, it'd probably be $30, and it just kind of goes to show how vinyl's gone up, which I understand. There's more for shipping, more for pressing, more people got their hands in the pot, like for distributors and record stores need to make their money. I get it. Like when you consider the prices of food going up 5 times, probably records going double in 25 years, I don't think is a huge deal. Although I get a little concerned, side topic, when records are going for $40 now, $45, $50 I've seen for some doubles and triple records. It's getting a little high, but it's just you buy what you can and you enjoy what you can, and it all depends on your bankroll. Like I always tell people, like people get so caught up in the prices of vinyl. I'm just like, there's so much good music out there. Just buy something else that's less expensive and that you're okay with buying. There's so much good music on there. I tell people, like, if they don't buy a copy on vinyl for $45, go get a CD copy for $12. If you can't afford to buy the digital copy for $9.99, whatever it is, or tape it from a friend. I mean, it's just music is meant to be heard. If you can't afford things right now, doesn't mean you won't have a copy later. And that's how I've always been. Like if I see a copy on CD or I see a copy on cassette and I'd rather have it on vinyl, I don't care. I can play CDs, I can play cassette, I can play vinyl, I can play digital. So I buy a copy, and if I really like it and I enjoy it, then I eventually buy it on the other format. That's just how I am. I just want to hear the music. I'm not dedicated to one format. That's just me. But this was a solid album. I wouldn't say it's one of their better ones, but it was important for their legacy for sure. And so strangely enough, in 2004, I was at this record store, and I talk about this record store a lot. I know this is supposed to be a review on Inferno, but I'm kind of it's the first time I've featured BOC on my channel, so I'm going through my history. But I remember I talk about it often. This record store that I was near when I had just moved to Washington D.C. in late 2003, and there was this record store in near Arlington. And it was called Orpheus Records, and it must have been there for like 30, 35 years. The record store owner, he was probably in his late 60s, early 70s, and you could just tell the record store had been there for years and years, probably 30 years at least. Very dusty, it smelled like old vinyl, it smelled like old shellac records, and I mean there was probably hundreds and hundreds of thousands. It was a very big record store, and I can't even imagine the back area, because I didn't even go into the back area, but I went sort of into the deeper bins, and they were just, it was unreal. It wasn't great for electronic music, but you get a lot of disco, and that's where I really got a chance to find some rare disco records, funk records, electro records, early house records, and also ambient records and kind of avant-garde record. And that store really, I think I got all my Tangerine Dream collection in that period of time of like 2003, 2005. A lot of times when you go to record stores, you kind of buy what they have, right? If you're surrounded by, let's say, 4 or 5 record stores, and then maybe they're not totally meeting your needs on what you want to look for like new electronic music, I'd still get into, because there's always something I can find and discover and you really get into. So I knew about Tangerine Dream already. I knew about a lot of avant-garde kind of electronic music, and even prog rock, all kinds of different electronic music. And so, that kind of fed my desire to get more into that and buy that. So I was buying older stuff. And so the electronic collection, the new bins were very, very meager. And the strange thing is, I was shopping, and there was a copy of Music Has a Right, and they had 2 copies, and they were both sealed. And this was the first reissue in 2004. And so if you look here, it still says the date on here, $24.99 for a double record too. But it says the date here, hard to see, but on the top here it says June 18th, 2004. So this, I'm assuming this is I don't know if they reissued in 2004. I would assume they reissued some in 2002, but this could be original copy. I'm not sure. I'm assuming it's probably the first reissue of Boards of Canada. Music Has a Right, but I bought 2 copies. That one I've played once, because again I had 2 copies on CD, and one got lost along the way. But I've always played my BOC on CD, but I've still kept this one sealed now for 22 years, and I don't know if it's a first copy or second copy, but I would imagine it's pretty rare if it's a sealed copy. So I'll still keep this sealed just because it's a great album, and maybe one day I'll sell it, or maybe one day I'll open it up. But in 2003 they came out with Giotti, and I'll review all these in the future. And then 2000, Trans-Canada Highway was the first single on the Boards of Canada album, I think 2007. Campfire Head Phase came out. And then also Tomorrow's Harvest in 2013. So first of all, I wanted to go track by track and just kind of give you my thoughts and my rating on each track. And then at the end, I go over just my overall thoughts on the album. So it starts off with the first track, which is an intro track called Introit. And a lot of times, Boards of Canada do this type of sound. It sounds like the beginning of some sort of like film projector or film, like 70s film, like documentary, and that's where the band really got their inspiration from. The two gentlemen, I always forget their names, but they moved from Scotland to Canada in the middle 70s, if I'm not mistaken. They're a couple years older than me, and really got inspired by watching these documentaries, these 70s documentaries, and kind of projection films, and sort of that really inspired the sound of the band. And so there's always that kind of feel to their songs, and there's kind of haziness and also almost like a tattered sort of film, analog film, reel to reel feel in their songs. They always kind of have that, and this track has that kind of like Viacom, like those kind of like advertisements at the beginning of some kind of like 70s low budget movie or documentary or something like that. So this is this is a kind of like a staple sound for the band. I won't necessarily give this track a rating because it's only 37 seconds long, but good intro. And then track number 2, Prophecy at 1420 megahertz. And this was one of the two tracks that Boards of Canada released a few days before the actual album came out, just to kind of hype up the songs and get people interested in hearing them. And this one's the most straightforward Boards of Canada sound versus the other one was a little bit more of a longer interlude. And this is kind of ancient sounding, but it's vintage Boards of Canada. I mean, the whole album is kind of vintage Boards of Canada for sure. But I think one of the first things that you hear when you listen to this song is how strong the beat is, how defined the guitar is. And as it kind of evolves, gets a little bit darker. It's a little bit more mystical, I think, than previous Boards of Canada. It almost feels like I'm like watching like Wicker Man. It has that sort of like B movie kind of horror feel in it. But I'm happy it doesn't go back into the beat. The beat is really strong, but at the end, it doesn't necessarily go back into the beat. So I like that. I like that it does. It doesn't do that because it makes you want to play the track again. And the beat is really strong too, really punchy. And just a really strong track, definitely in the upper echelon of Boards of Canada's music throughout their whole catalog, and definitely a highlight of this album. And also my brother's favorite song on this album, and definitely a favorite of a lot of people that have heard this album in their first few listens through. And I gave it an 8.5 out of 10. And then you have track 3 called Hydrogen, Helium, Lithium, Leviathan. And it kind of sounds like that, to be honest with you. It does have this kind of like deep, kind of almost underground, kind of aquatic, kind of angry sound in the bass line and the synth. It's just a really sick production and a really strong track. And again, I love when Boards of Canada fade out the melody like in these tracks. It just gives it such a whimsical, old school vibe. Just kind of supports that kind of 70s sound with some of these fade outs, and a really strong track. And I give it a 7.75 out of 10. Very good, kind of verging right on excellent. Track number 4 is called Age of Capricorn. And maybe this is the first sign of me sort of being like a Boards of Canada snob in a way, because I'm kind of torn with the vocal, and maybe that's probably the biggest contention of the album from other people that would listen to the album, longtime Boards of Canada fans. There's a couple tracks on this album where the vocal is just maybe a little bit too pronounced, maybe too forward in the mix, maybe says too much, maybe it's a little bit corny, maybe it's too audible to figure out what he's saying. It's too direct. There's a lot of times when samples in Boards of Canada is very hidden and it's kind of muffled and you're trying to figure out. But I think that's one of the hallmarks of Boards of Canada sound is everything is up for your interpretation of what you think the music is, how it makes you feel, what are they talking about, you know. And when the vocal is this pronounced in the track, it gives you kind of a, I don't know, I wouldn't go as far as saying cheesy, but it's borderline on that. Everything else about the track is really strong. I really love the progression of the melody. In fact, it's very, with the vocals as well, kind of mimicking the evolution of the melody. It's really strong, but I can't help but taking at least a point away from the score because the vocal, and I think this would be an excellent track without it, but with the vocal, you know, I give it a 7 out of 10 stars. I still think it's a very good track, but I would rather maybe the vocal be at least lower in the mix, if not, you know, more effects on it, like most of the other vocals. This one almost seems like a narrator is kind of talking versus maybe some of the other tracks. It sounds like, you know, some kind of sound like a demon, or you know, there's such effects on it that you can't really tell what it's saying, or at least some of them you can, but it's very morphed. And but this one is so pronounced, it sounds like a narrator over the track. And in some ways that's cool, but in some ways it's kind of verging on maybe they went a little too far with it. But you know, that's kind of the arc of the a lot of the albums is. I think if you're pushing the envelope a little bit, like this kind of pushes the theme of the envelope of the theme a little bit, maybe a little bit too far. But you know, this album also, you know, pushes the envelope a little bit on some of the synths, and some are like growling, and some have a little bit more aggression and have a lot of detail, and almost bordering on like a slower electro sound, especially in some of the other tracks. So they have like a more aggressive sound, and it's not so much just kind of down tempo with samples and melodies. It's like it's a little bit heavier, and so I like that production angle on the whole album and that evolution. I do feel like this album, and I'll get into this a little bit later with my overall thoughts, but I do think it does its job when it comes to you expecting the album to be a little pushing the envelope a little bit on the sounds. I do think for the most part it does a good job. I feel like there could have been some more tracks that do that, but when you break down the tracks, there's probably half of them where the synths or the beat is pushing the envelope a little farther than previous albums. So I think that's a win. But Age of Capricorn, strong song, 7 out of 10 stars. And then track number 5 called Father and Son. This is actually my least liked song on the album. And I still think it's a good song. I give it 6 out of 10 stars, but it's kind of the good things about it, the eerie travelness, and it sounds like a scam, a track that was off Scam, or maybe it sounds a little bit like Bola, if you guys know the music of Bola, which I love. So that beat is a little bit more, I wouldn't say closer to hip hop, but it's kind of verging on trap. And so I very much, you'll have to forgive me, I very much dislike a lot of trap beats. And this is kind of verging on it. I do think the vocal is very clever because it's almost like it's gated, or the envelope of the effect is tied to the vocal, or excuse me, tied to the beat. So when the beat kind of jitters, and there's another track on this album that also does that, and so it kind of glitches the vocal with the beat, and I think that's really clever. But I don't necessarily like trap beats, and this is the other point of contention I have with the vocals. This is the second track, and they're right in a row, where the vocal is a little bit too pronounced and too a little bit up front for me, maybe even overdone. I want to get lost in the music, and when the vocal is this strong and so pronounced and so up in the mix, it's a little bit harder to get lost in the music, and I'd rather get lost in the music than be told about some kind of story in the track. So unfortunately, this is my least liked track in the album, but I still I still think it's a good track. Production is strong, as the whole album is, which you don't expect anything less from Boards of Canada when it comes to the strong, detailed, dynamic sound, and you know, everything is really strong in the audio spectrum. Deep frequencies, good highs, good mids. I mean, everything is very well balanced, and I would never even think to question Boards of Canada's quality of their productions. I mean, it's super strong. You know, it's just so, and I like how doesn't feel overly mastered. Like it feels strong, but it doesn't feel overly mastered where it's kind of verging on too loud. But Uh, Point of contention. The vocals on these two particular tracks kind of deter a little bit of the album, but I'm happy to say that as the album goes on, there's less and less vocals. So I was a little bit worried as I was playing this album. Track two with the vocals, track three, four, five. I was getting a little concerned that there was like too many vocals, and I'm happy to say as the album goes on, they kind of retreated from doing that and got more into the melodic side. I feel like, and better interludes as the album goes on. So I feel like the album does get stronger as it goes on. And then comes the interlude, track number six, called "Somewhere Right Now in the Future." Solid interlude. I give it 7 out of 10 stars. And a lot of times when I rate some of my favorite bands, a lot of times I compare them to each other or songs they've done previously, and a lot of times scores, as much as I'm trying to score the track and how I enjoy it and what I think about it. I also do compare them to other tracks they've done. So, I'm giving this track a 7 as far as the interlude, but that's kind of comparing them to other interludes that they've done through their career. So that I think it's very good for a short interlude, but it's not like it's just hard to rate certain tracks that are 30 seconds, a minute and 30 seconds that don't do too much, but they really do add character to the album, and that's what Boards of Canada do a great job of. And then it goes into track number six called Naraka. This is one of the most clever tracks on the album, I feel like. The beat is really cool. And I don't think there's ever been a Boards of Canada track that feels like it samples or has the vibe of an Indian feel. I wouldn't say to the point where, and when I say Indian, I don't mean like India, the country, like more like American Indian, like because it's not like it's almost like a chanting becomes the hook. And at first, when I heard the hook, I was like, I'm not sure if I like that hook, but it gets so addictive and so hypnotizing through the track, and it only does it through the second half, and maybe it does it for a minute and a half, which generally, like when a track is sampled that much, or that sample is going on that long, you kind of get a little bit, I wouldn't say annoyed by it, but you sort of question it a little bit, or maybe it's just gone on too long. But in this track, it really becomes more hypnotizing, and I think it's really a very creative track because I've never really quite heard a Boards of Canada track with a sort of an Indian feel on it. And so I think it's very successful in that, especially the last minute or so. It kind of fades all out into like a dreamlike state, and that's really clever too. It's not, and I think one thing where I feel like it's really creative and very unique for Boards of Canada, because it's not necessarily a track that I would normally like. Not saying that I don't like Indian kind of samples, but tracks that kind of have a repeating sample for so long, and then the type of sample it is, it's more vocal too, so it's not ideally in my bag as far as my favorite Boards of Canada style, but it's just hard to knock the catchiness of it, and it just wins you over, and it becomes one of my favorite tracks on the album, probably in my top 6 or 7 tracks on the album. I think it's an excellent song. I give it 8.25 stars. Very, very different track for Boards of Canada, and so I appreciate that, and it really kind of brings the album back to where I enjoy it after maybe a couple questionable tracks in Age of Capricorn and Father and Son, just because of the vocals again. This kind of brings the album back on track for me. And then track number 8, called Acts of Magic. This track's only a minute and 18 seconds, so a little hard to give it a score, but I really like the ominous feeling in this track. It's very ancient sounding, tribal, muddy, and also experimental. It definitely kind of resets your listening palette, if I can say that, in towards bridging into going into the second, or about to go into the second half of the album. So I really like this kind of interlude because it really takes you in a different direction and drops you, so it's kind of like a slow bridge, or maybe even quick because it's only a minute 18 seconds, but it kind of resets the album, and it gives the opportunity for the artist to go into a different direction, or at least especially coming from the more tribal track before it. It's a great interlude into the next track. And then track number 9 called Memory Death. This is one of my favorite interludes of the album. And it's not quite an interlude because it's 2 minutes and 37 seconds, but it doesn't do too much. But what's there is really awesome. It does sound like just like the title, Memory Death. The memory is right, that's for sure. It's beautiful, it's melancholy, it's a balance of something that someone could perceive as a little bit annoying. So it feels a little bit experimental, but it also is something beautiful to balance it. So it has this really kind of great dichotomy of of eeriness and also beauties. And I always look for that in Boards of Canada albums and songs because that's kind of the balance, right? That's the balance of life, that evil and good and young and old and life and death and stuff. And so I always have that sort of feeling in Boards of Canada album that it mimics that and or sort of is a musical soundtrack to that evolution of life. But this track is a great interlude, and I just love it because it also helps the album flow so well. It's like these little moments for me are as important as the tracks themselves. Like there's certain tracks that are great, but the interludes tie it all together for me and make it a great listening album. And this is one of my favorite, Memory Death, with an 8.25 stars out of 10. Excellent track. And then track number 10 called The Word Becomes Flesh, tied with the 1420 megahertz track for my favorite through the first half. Give this one 8.5 stars. Best beat yet. It's kind of like a broken electro, really dark, and I really love the effect and the growlingness of, if is that the word, growlingness of the growl of the bass line, the aggressiveness in the bass line, just really sick stuff. And that's the kind of the key with the vocals. Like, it doesn't necessarily work on a trap beat earlier. It doesn't necessarily, some of the vocals, or I wouldn't say they don't work, but they're a little bit questionable when they're straightforward like this. But when the beat, like this kind of, like when you go back to Music Has a Right and you listen to like, Pete Standing Alone, which is, or if you remember the track called Orange and it has that beat. And this is kind of like an updated version of that, I feel. And it's just like this, like I said earlier in one of the other tracks, like the vocal is kind of synced with the beat. It's kind of like gated and affected. So when the beat kind of jitters, it kind of stutters the vocal, so it kind of sounds like a tape not playing well, or a kind of like a glitch in the recording. And that's such a cool effect. And I like that. I think if there's any effect on the album that immediately I was like, well, that's really clever. I've heard people do that before, but in Boards of Canada, it works awesome. And this is one of the coolest tracks yet, and it gives so far my highest score at 8.5. So then we get into the second half of the album. Track number 11, Into the Magic Land. This one has a little bit of a country sound to it. It has a little bit of a Western sort of country sound to it. Almost feels like it could be like from a cinema, like a movie, or, just kind of the twangy guitars and the hazy effects. And then track number 12, Blood in the Labyrinth, I like even a little bit better. Kind of vintage sound, a busy kind of down-tempo beat. Sounds like something off of Tomorrow's Harvest. And I give Into the Magic Land a 7.5, and then Blood in the Labyrinth I like a little bit better, 7.75. It's really close to an excellent track. I feel like that one's really close, and I feel like if there's any track so far that grows on you, Blood in the Labyrinth is kind of a little bit more subdued, or maybe a little bit less aggressive than some of the tracks have been before. So it's in a, I guess, a long listen over time and years, like this track will grow because it's kind of tucked in, and it's kind of like it's just not as obvious, and it just feels like a song that will grow in appreciation as I move on with this album. But again, really strong track, 7.75 stars for Blood in the Labyrinth. And then comes track number 13, Deep Time. This is my second favorite song on the album, my favorite sort of shorter track. The melody is great in here. I love the darker ambient first minute and a half, really kind of darker, and then it just opens up and this beautiful melody comes out, a little bit twinkling in the background. Just sounds like a great movie score. It almost reminds me of like something like God moving over the face of the waters by like Moby. You know, something that would work great for the end of a movie when the bad guy dies, like in Heat. Like this track has that kind of power, and so cinematic and so dramatic and so beautiful at the same time. Just a amazing track. I give Deep Time. Again, my second favorite track on the album, 9.25 stars. Awesome track. And then track number 14, All Reason Departs. This is the longest song on the album and one of the sickest beats on the record. The drums are killer in here. I love the percussion. It's different, a little bit more tribal. The sound, the drums sound a little bit more wooden and primal and tribal. And so I really like the kind of ancient feeling of this track. It almost sounds like a dub version of a BOC track. It's just, and not only is it the longest track, but it's one of the only tracks where it gets into a groove. Like you hardly ever see Boards of Canada do a track over 6 minutes, let alone a track that finds a groove and kind of doesn't change too much for a minute, minute and a half, almost even a 2 minute track. And this kind of does that, except for the highlighting the really cool percussion and the really sick groove. So this one is not only one of the sickest grooves and beats on the album, but one of the deepest tracks and one of the ones that's really hypnotizing and one that I would play probably in a down tempo set. Or it doesn't, I wouldn't say it does feel like a BOC track, but it doesn't. I don't think 100% of the people would say, "Oh, that's a BOC track." I think maybe 90% would, but at least there's some people out there that would be like, "Okay, this does sort of sound like BOC, but I'm not sure." But when you listen to the rest of the album tracks, you're like, "Oh, that's immediately BOC." Especially if you're a fan, you'd recognize pretty much any BOC track. But this one, in a way, it just feels like something different that they've really never done. And I guess that's the length of the track, the groove of the track, and just kind of a deeper minimalism in the groove of the track. Just awesome stuff. One of my favorite songs as well. 8.5 stars for All Reasons Departs. And then track 15 called Arena Amera Canada. Some good sounds on here. The bass line's really cool. I wouldn't necessarily say it's one of the upper echelon tracks on this album as far as like the longer tracks, but it goes well after the last one because those are probably the two deepest tracks as far as like full tracks on the album, All Reasons Apart and track 15, Arena Amera Canada. But it's not necessarily a super high ranking track for me. Maybe it'll grow on me over time. Still think it's a very good track, 7.25 stars, but I don't think it's quite to the. Maybe it gets lost a little bit in some of the other tracks throughout the album. Maybe this one just doesn't stand out as much, but that may mean it grows over time. But for the first three listens through, I think it's a very good track, 7.25 stars. And then it goes into track number 16 called The Process, which is 3 minutes and 1 second kind of interlude. Probably the most gentle track on this album, maybe the most peaceful. The piano is really nice. I do think it's one of the better interludes. I give it a 7.5 stars. And then it goes into track 17, my favorite track on the album. It's called You Retreat in Time and Space. It sounds like you're walking into a church and like at a wake or something like that, and sort of has like a hymn going in the background. Just kind of gives me like this organ church vibe where you're kind of going into a empty church. And it's just beautiful, and then it evolves into a vintage Boards of Canada track with some sounds that sound eerily familiar with that vintage, perfect, almost signature sound of Boards of Canada. A track that sounds like it's from Campfire Headphase. I won't tell you which one it is. I'm sure you'll probably point that out as well, but if you're a big BOC fan, but it's got everything you want, and it almost sounds like a remix to an older Boards of Canada track, if you know what I'm talking about. But it's got everything you want from a Boards of Canada track. I give it 9.5 stars. Awesome track. And then it goes into the last track, which is the kind of the outro. It's called I Saw Through Plantonia. A bit haunting ending, a bit eerie, but a nice way to end the album. Very kind of somber. And I give it 7.5 stars. And then when I talk about the overall of the album, there's three things that I look for in Boards of Canada albums when a new one comes out. First one is, does it evolve the theme? Does it flow well? How's the story? Does it make me think? Does it give me like a certain mood that I kind of expect from Boards of Canada? The second thing is, does it push the envelope of the audio? Is it more aggressive? Is it more calm? Does it push the envelope? Does it sound different in a way? And then third thing, does it have the interludes? How's the album flow? Those are really the three things that I look for in a Boards of Canada. And this does all of them really well. The arc of the album feels really strong, a little bit darker on this album. There's kind of a darker spirit or soul in this album. As far as the production, there's much more of a snap in the drums. Almost sounds like a real live drummer on certain tracks. The strings are always important to Boards of Canada, that kind of 70s feel that make you what I call almost like grocery store music in the 70s. Kind of gives me this memories of growing up in the 70s. It just kind of has that vintage kind of haziness feel to it, very whimsical sounding. Certainly this album has that as well. And then it has some signature BOC songs where the melody morphs and there's the really cool beats. And the production is not surprisingly brilliant. It's definitely an event when listening to Boards of Canada album. I think that's why people look forward to their albums so much, because they are powerful, they are impactful. It does sound like you're listening to memories, and as you keep listening to the album and you come back to it, they those memories kind of come back, and even if they are just of listening to the songs, it's such a visual experience when you listen to a Boards of Canada album. When you think of downtempo music, a lot of times you think of like elevator music or just background music, and generally downtempo is, especially instrumental downtempo, can be a very banal and very average sounding genre of music. I've certainly gone over some of the highlights in the past, and I think that's one great thing about electronic music is through the 90s, through the acid jazz, through IDM, through downtempo, different styles of electronic downtempo music, it's made the genre better. But this is, when you listen to Boards of Canada, it almost transcends a sort of banal style of music into something that's so much more, and it's so um, when that style of music can be so mundane and so supportive as a music style, this almost transcends it again from something that's more listenable, something that again that earns your attention, that you come back to again, that incorporates memories and something, and that's just so far from what downtempo music is being like background music or commercial music or just generally elevator music with a beat. Like, this is so much farther, taking the style so much farther into just taking that style of music so far, that's what Boards of Canada have really done for that style of music, and that's why I believe they're so adored. You may not think it evolves in a huge step from old Boards of Canada, but when you think back to the other albums, they don't really evolve too much. I mean, maybe the story evolves a little bit, maybe the production evolves a little bit, but it's not breaking new ground. Like, you know what you're going to get with the Boards of Canada album, and I think this album delivers. I give it an 80 out of 100. I think it's an excellent album. It is on the low side of an excellent album, but I think it earns that respect, and I'm looking forward to reviewing the other Boards of Canada albums and see where this one ranks. I'm looking forward to doing like a top 50 Boards of Canada tracks and also ranking the albums as well. But this is kind of the start of that. But yeah, it's kind of my experience with Boards of Canada. Sorry, this video was a little bit longer and I got a little bit off track with certain things and not just a direct review of the album. But I also wanted to give my experience with Boards of Canada and just kind of share my background, a little bit of that, and also show some of the records and some of the stories behind me purchasing those. So bear with me on that. If there's something that you'd like me to review in the future video, my email's down below. Just message me. I'd love to know your thoughts on this album and where you think you might rank it in the Boards of Canada album series. And we'll see you on the next video, and I appreciate your time. Thanks so much.